At the age of 74, Mark Knopfler quietly placed his guitars on the auction block. When the sale closed, the instruments had brought in nearly $9 million. To fans around the world, it felt like a signal, a clearing of space before a return, a hint that the past might be revisited. But that interpretation missed the truth entirely. For decades, one question had followed him everywhere. Why would Dire Straits never reunite? The reason was never about clashing egos or crowded calendars. It ran far deeper. It stretched back to 216 concerts packed into 14 relentless months, to a fractured bond with his own brother, and to a way of living that pushed him close to breaking. In 2024, Knopfler finally spoke plainly about what those massive tours had taken from him, and why no financial reward could ever tempt him back. Mark Knopfler was born on August 12, 1949, in Glasgow, a city still exhausted by history. Although the war had officially ended 4 years earlier, its presence lingered everywhere. Food rationing was only just easing. Bomb-damaged streets were still being repaired. The future felt uncertain. His parents had married in Newcastle in 1947 before moving north, compressing their growing family into a modest flat. Ruth arrived first in 1947, Mark followed 2 years later, and David was born in 1952. Glasgow's shipyards were shrinking, jobs were disappearing, and suspicion of outsiders was hardening. Knopfler's father, a Hungarian Jew, stood out immediately. His background alone made steady work difficult, and even his training as an architect failed to secure stability. Money was scarce, and tension filled the rooms they lived in. In 1956, when Mark was 7, the family uprooted once more. They left Scotland and traveled roughly 120 miles southeast to Blaydon, a coalport town along the North Sea. It was his mother Louise's hometown, and they hoped her teaching position would offer some financial ground to stand on. The move traded one battered industrial city for a quieter, gray working town. Mark didn't realize it at the time, but crossing that border marked the beginning of how he would understand place, identity, and belonging for the rest of his life. Louisa Mary Laidler came from Blaydon, a town shaped by coal dust, ships, and repetition. She trained as a teacher, played the piano, and relied on both to keep the family afloat. After long days at school, she would still sit at the piano in the evening, gathering the children for sing-alongs. Often, it was her salary alone that held the household together. Blaydon sat just 10 miles from Newcastle, close enough for Mark to watch factories close, workers endure, and accents carry generations of quiet resilience. Those voices and streets would later find their way into his songwriting through precise place names and unadorned language that never asked for pity. His father, Erwin, lived with a heavier history. Born into a Hungarian Jewish family, he fled Budapest in 1939 at around 16 years old as anti-Jewish laws tightened across Europe. He arrived in Britain alone. The family he left behind would later face the Holocaust, while he struggled to survive as a stateless refugee. In post-war Britain, first in Glasgow, then in Blaydon, his accent, his Marxist politics, and his openly agnostic views kept him on the margins of polite society. At home, conversations turned into fierce debates about religion, power, class, and war. Ideas were pushed back and forth like chess pieces. Erwin trusted reasoning over authority, shaped by watching an entire continent collapse. Years later, Mark would channel that same skepticism into songs that questioned nationalism and conflict without ever raising their voice. The Knopfler household was loving, but never peaceful. Money worries hovered constantly. Louisa believed education and music offered a way forward. Erwin demanded critical thinking and rejected easy conclusions. Mark grew up watching ideals collide with the rigid British class system of the 1950s. He absorbed the gap between belief and reality. That tension would later surface in his music, stories of ordinary men caught inside forces far larger than themselves, told without melodrama or hero worship. Music took hold of him after the move to Blaydon. Around the age of 7, he watched his uncle Kingsley sit at the piano, hammering out boogie-woogie rhythms while blowing blues through a harmonica. The sound stopped him cold. Knopfler would later say that those simple 3 chords were the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He didn't own a guitar, so he grabbed a cheap tennis racket and played it like one, forming imaginary chords in the air, rehearsing a future he couldn't yet define, but already felt he needed. By around 1959, when he was 10, his parents managed to buy him a real guitar. It was an inexpensive Spanish-style model, nothing like the red Fender Stratocaster he dreamed about. He was left-handed, but learned on a right-handed guitar out of necessity, quietly rewiring himself. The strings sat high, the neck was thick, and his fingers ached constantly. There was no amplifier, no pedals, no extras. He played softly, using bare fingers instead of a pick. His thumb and fingers learned to work independently. What began as limitation slowly became identity. That restrained fingerstyle approach would later become instantly recognizable around the world. Adolescence in Bladen and Newcastle offered little comfort. Standing out made him a target. School could be unforgiving, so he retreated to his room with a guitar. Late at night, he pressed close to a small radio, stopping and rewinding songs to catch Beatles melodies, Bob Dylan progressions, and Chicago blues bends. He moved through school bands during the 1960s, touching skiffle, folk, and early rock. But the real education happened alone. Obsession grew alongside isolation. His bedroom became a private conservatory long before anyone noticed him. Fear about money never left. He had spent his childhood watching his father struggle for work, watching how close the family lived to the edge. One missed payment could tilt everything. That awareness stayed with him, a quiet pressure beneath the music, shaping both the man he became and the choices he would one day refuse to make. That sense of insecurity settled deep inside him. Years later, it would quietly surface in Sultans of Swing, written in the mid-1970s and released in 1978, a song that observes small pub bands playing for next to nothing while the rest of the world moves on without noticing. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. In 1970, at around 20 years old, Knopfler enrolled at the University of Leeds to study English. He completed his degree in 1973. While many of his peers mapped out stable careers, his nights unfolded in cramped clubs across Leeds and Yorkshire. Alongside Steve Phillips, performing as a Dwellian string pickers, he played folk and blues to rooms thick with smoke and thin with people, sometimes no more than 30 at a time. The pay was minimal, a few pounds and free drinks. But night after night, he was shaping the style that would later define him, slowly, deliberately, and without shortcuts. In April 1970, he recorded a simple home demo titled Summer's Coming My Way. His diploma would say English, but his direction was already clear. After graduating, he took a position as an English lecturer at Loughton College in Essex in 1973. It was a practical decision, not a calling. By day, he taught literature. By night, he moved through London's pub rock circuit, playing with bands like Brewer's Droop and later Cafe Racers. He loaded vans, played poorly paid shows, and lived between two worlds. His teaching salary, paid for a motorbike, kept his father's car running, and slowly added to his collection of guitars. That double life carried him through the mid-1970s, quietly laying the groundwork for what would follow. Brewer's Droop was already a struggling pub band when Knopfler joined in 1973. They played unforgiving rooms, faced heavy drinking crowds, and chased gigs that barely cover expenses. The recordings he made with them would remain unreleased until 1989, unheard for more than 16 years. Progress was slow, and survival was uncertain. By June 1977, Knopfler was 27 and barely holding things together in southeast London. He lived in a worn council flat in Deptford, scraping by on short teaching contracts and occasional journalism while continuing to play pub gigs at night. London felt overwhelming, loud, crowded, and expensive, and most days involved counting coins. But that summer, something shifted. He began assembling a band. His younger brother, David, joined on rhythm guitar. John Ilsley, a social worker by day, played bass. Pick Withers, a jazz-leaning drummer with real session experience, completed the lineup. They rehearsed wherever space could be found. Tiny flats, mattresses propped against walls, extension cables stretched across floors. Amplifiers were shared because no one could afford enough of their own. Sometimes Mark walked miles across the city with his guitar in a soft case just to save bus fare. It was hot, uncomfortable, and uncertain. Yet within a year, songs born in those suffocating rooms would be heard on stages around the world. At first, they didn't even have a name. One night, as they worried aloud about unpaid rent and empty pockets, a friend laughed and said they were in dire straits. The phrase stuck because it felt painfully accurate. Around July 1977, they scraped together less than 50 pounds, borrowed a 2-track Revox tape machine, and recorded a demo in a friend's kitchen. Blankets were draped over cupboards to deaden the sound. Tape was expensive, so everything was recorded quickly. No retakes, no polish. On that fragile reel were early versions of Sultans of Swing, Down to the Waterline, Water of Love, and Wild West End. The demo was copied onto cassettes and hand-delivered to radio DJs and record labels across London. Most never responded, but the recordings were clear enough to reveal Knopfler's fingerstyle guitar and calm, observational voice. A kitchen session was quietly opening doors. One tape reached Charlie Gillett at BBC Radio London. He hosted a Sunday program called Honky Tonk, and he listened. Late in 1977, he invited the band to play a small pub show, the kind where the room barely fills. That night, they played Sultans of Swing. The song had been inspired months earlier when Knopfler watched an amateur jazz band perform to almost no audience in a near-empty bar, proudly calling themselves the Sultans of Swing. He wrote the phrase down that same night on Forrester's in July 1977. Gillett played the demo on air and read out the band's name and address. Letters and phone calls followed. Labels that had previously ignored them suddenly showed interest. In less than 6 weeks, everything changed. By the end of 1977, Dire Straits signed with Vertigo under Phonogram after countless rejections from A&R executives convinced that guitar bands were finished in the wake of punk. In February 1978, the band entered Basing Street Studios in Notting Hill with producer Muff Winwood and a budget of roughly £2,500, modest even then. The album was recorded in about 2 weeks, much of it played live to preserve the tight, unvarnished sound of the pubs they came from. When the album was released in 1978, it moved slowly in the UK. But Sultans of Swing found momentum on FM radio in the Netherlands and the United States. By early 1979, the single reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album climbed into the UK top 10 and peaked at number 2 in the US. Within a year, more than 1 million copies had been sold. A band that had struggled to cover rent was suddenly touring internationally. The rise was rapid and the pressure immediate. Knopfler wrote most of the material and controlled the arrangements. David, just 25 when the band formed, began to feel sidelined. Songs he brought to early sessions were left off the album. Arguments over guitar parts and studio decisions intensified. Even as audiences embraced the sound of early Dire Straits, the relationship between two brothers was quietly fracturing. And the pace never slowed. Communique came together at speed in late 1978 and early 1979, recorded with Jerry Wexler and Barry Beckett, including sessions in the Bahamas. It was released in June 1979, barely a year after the debut album. There was no pause to absorb success. That same year alone, Dire Straits played well over 110 shows, often performing every 2 or 3 days. Life narrowed into a cycle of tour buses, hotel rooms, sound checks, and late nights. Looking back, Mark would admit the record sounded too close to the first one. That sense of repetition followed him on the road, a quiet dissatisfaction growing alongside the applause. By July 1980, work began on making movies in New York with producer Jimmy Iovine, and the pressure felt different. The sessions stretched on. Expectations were heavier now, and the atmosphere grew tighter. Romeo and Juliet emerged directly from a painful breakup, its emotional sharpness cut straight from lived experience. By August 1980, the strain finally broke. David Knopfler walked out in the middle of recording. None of his parts remained on the album. In less than 3 years, what had begun as a family band turned into something colder, more distant, and unmistakably lonelier. When Brothers in Arms took shape between late 1984 and early 1985, the scale had changed entirely. Recorded at Air Studios on the island of Montserrat, the budget had grown to around £300,000. The studio sat in the shadow of a volcano, with tropical storms rolling through as the band worked on what would become one of the first fully digital rock albums ever made. When it was released in May 1985, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. The album sold more than 30 million copies worldwide and became the first to sell 1 million CDs. Money for Nothing reached number 1 in the United States, and its animated video became the first ever broadcast on MTV UK. There was irony in it all. A song mocking rockstar excess transformed Dire Straits into a global symbol of exactly that. The Brothers in Arms tour ran from 1985 into 1986 and beyond, stretching across roughly 230 to 247 shows in around 100 cities, played to an estimated 7.1 million people. Night after night, Mark delivered 3-hour performances. His hands paid the price. Tendons and nerves became inflamed, Hotel rooms turned into recovery spaces where he iced his hands just to make it through the next show. At home, his marriage was under strain. His twin sons, born in 1987, mostly knew their father from television screens. By 1991, Mark Knopfler stepped into the next Dire Straits chapter, carrying the weight of everything that had come before. On Every Street was meant to follow Brothers in Arms, the album that had sold 30 million copies. That number hovered in the background, even when no one said it aloud. When recording began in early 1990, it was no longer just about writing songs. It was about trying to match a moment that had already hardened into legend. This was where Knopfler's perfectionism began to shift from strength to burden. Parts were scrapped again and again. Chords were reworked, lines rewritten, takes discarded, not because they were bad, but because they were not perfect. Sessions stretched on. Weeks turned into months. Release dates slipped. The studio bills kept rising, burning steadily in the background. When the album finally arrived, it did not fail. It sold between 5 and 5.3 million copies worldwide, a remarkable figure for most artists. But set against 30 million, it felt diminished. Expectations have a way of turning success into something that feels like defeat. In some countries, the push was immense. In France, the label shipped 300,000 copies before release. The album debuted at number 1, eventually surpassing 1.2 million sales and earning diamond certification. On paper, it looked like a triumph. But the mood soon shifted. Sales slowed. Critics and fans began to say it lacked the spark of the 1979 to 1985 era. Even Mark would later admit he could feel, deep down, that the chapter was closing while he was still trying to perfect every bar. Then came the tour, and once it started, there was no easing into it. From August 1991 to October 1992, Dire Straits embarked on a relentless run of roughly 216 concerts across Europe, North America, and Australia. Around 7.1 million tickets were sold. From a distance, the numbers suggested glory. Up close, they felt more like confinement. The band on stage was no longer the group that had formed in cramped London flats. Phil Palmer now handled rhythm guitar, replacing founding member David Knopfler. The lineup expanded into a large touring operation. Each night-long, meticulously constructed shows revolved around extended versions of Telegraph Road, Sultans of Swing, and the newer material. The performances were polished and powerful and deeply exhausting. Some weeks packed 4 or 5 arena shows into a single stretch. Travel days offered no recovery, only more movement through airports, buses, and hotels. Eventually, the body demanded payment. Late in the tour in Milan, exhaustion caught up with Mark in a moment he could not play through. He became severely dehydrated and fatigued, requiring 4 fluids backstage. Several shows were canceled. The image cracked, revealing how close the entire operation was to physical collapse. People around the tour later describe it as 14 months on a conveyor belt, life reduced to forward motion with no way to step off. All the while, beneath the clean, spacious sound audiences heard on record, tension had long been building. Years earlier, original drummer Pick Withers had already walked away after Love Over Gold in 1982. He later described Knopfler's increasingly meticulous studio methods and extended rehearsals as dictatorial. His instincts leaned toward jazz and looseness. Mark's vision demanded control and precision. That difference was not minor. It was structural, the kind that slowly erodes a band from the inside out. By the time On Every Street finally arrived, the original core of Dire Straits was already gone. Pick Withers never returned after his departure in the early 1980s. David Knopfler had exited much earlier, walking away during the tense-making movie sessions in 1980. What remained was no longer the group that had shaped songs together in cramped Deptford rooms in the late 1970s. The rhythm section was now assembled from highly skilled session musicians, professionals who could execute every part with precision. The live band sounded immaculate, but some critics and longtime fans sensed something had changed. The performances were flawless, yet safer, less volatile, less alive. It felt to some like Mark Knopfler standing at the center of an elite backing unit, rather than a band moving instinctively as a single organism. That subtle shift mattered. Even with sold-out arenas, it nudged the project closer to its edge. When the tour finally ended in late 1992, Mark was finished in a way that had nothing to do with sales or status. He was worn down physically and emptied mentally. Instead of announcing a dramatic breakup, he placed Dire Straits on hiatus. Publicly, it sounded open-ended. Privately, he had no interest in returning to the arena cycle. And running quietly alongside all of this was another absence, the silence between brothers. David had left in 1980, and the relationship never truly healed. Over the years, interviews hinted at how little contact they had after the early 1990s. There were unresolved tensions over songwriting, credit, control, and what it meant to step away just as success exploded. Fans held on to hope for reconciliation, for a final chapter that might close the story properly. But time exerts its own pull. Mark built one life. David built another. The distance remained, and it lasted for more than 30 years. In 1995, Dire Straits officially dissolved after 6 studio albums. Even then, they were still among the best-selling rock acts in the world, with tens of millions of records sold. That is the part that surprises people. Most bands would chase one more tour simply to feel that scale again. But Mark kept stepping back. Promoters never stopped calling. The offers only grew larger. Bassist John Ilsley later described the reunion money as staggering. 8-figure packages proposed for global tours built around Money for Nothing and Brothers in Arms. He said that almost every meeting with Mark's management came with another enormous proposal attached. Each time, Mark declined. Again and again. He insisted he was happier playing smaller venues, writing at his own pace, working on his own terms. For him, it was never about revisiting the past. It was about protecting his sanity, about creative freedom, about never being trapped inside that pressure cooker again. Rather than returning to stadium rock, he quietly reset his public life. On March 25, 1996, he released his first solo studio album, Golden Heart. It arrived 8 years after Dire Straits' final studio record, On Every Street, and 1 year after the band formally dissolved. The direction was unmistakable. Smaller rooms, new colors. The studio environment built around Guy Fletcher, alongside Nashville and Irish session musicians. The sound leaned toward British folk, Celtic textures, and country swing, quieter, more reflective, more personal. The album ran for 71 minutes across 14 tracks and reached the UK top 10. That solo path became a long second life, 5 studio albums released between 1996 and 2007, later remastered together in 2021. It felt like a clean line drawn between who he had been and who he chose to become. Even before that transition was visible, Mark had already been shaping another identity in the background. As early as 1983, he accepted the job of scoring Local Hero, before Dire Straits had even released Brothers in Arms. That timing matters. It reveals a mindset already turning away from scale. He wrote music for a modest Scottish comedy long before becoming a stadium figure. The schedule was tight. Dozens of short cues were written and recorded in just weeks, each one tailored precisely to the timing of individual scenes. It was disciplined, technical work, and something unexpected emerged from it. The closing theme, Going Home, built around a simple, restrained guitar motif, took on a life far beyond the film. It became the pre-match anthem at Newcastle United's St. James Park. For decades, tens of thousands of people have heard it echo through the stadium. A quiet instrumental written for a small 1983 movie became one of the most widely recognized pieces of instrumental music in Britain. Then, in 1987, with The Princess Bride, he leaned even further into independence. Director Rob Reiner wanted a sweeping, traditional orchestral score. Mark refused. Instead, he centered the music around a synclavier, an advanced digital synthesizer, layering it with acoustic guitars and a handful of live instruments. It was an unconventional choice, understated and personal. And it reflected the same instinct that had been guiding him all along, to resist expectation, reduce scale, and follow the sound that felt true, even when the world was asking for something louder. Much of that score was built inside a single machine. Mark would improvise while watching the film play, shaping melodies in real time as scenes unfolded. Guy Fletcher worked beside him, scrambling to capture sudden shifts in harmony and rhythm as they happened. Embedded within that electronic world was Storybook Love, written and sung by Willie DeVille, then produced and woven into the score by Mark himself. The song earned an Academy Award nomination in 1988, eventually losing to I've Had the Time of My Life from Dirty Dancing. Even so, the melody endured. Decades later, it still anchors live orchestral performances of The Princess Bride, long outliving the moment that created it. By the time Sailing to Philadelphia was released on September 26, 2000, Knopfler's solo universe had widened considerably. It was his second solo studio album, and his most collaborative to that point, featuring guest vocals from James Taylor, Van Morrison, and others. The 13-track record wandered through American highways, radio evangelists, surveyors, and forgotten histories. Its title track drew inspiration from Thomas Pynchon's 1997 novel Mason and Dixon, an unlikely literary source for a former Stadium Rock frontman. The album charted strongly across Europe, going multi-platinum in countries like Norway and Denmark and reaching platinum status in the UK. By 2002, it had sold well over 1 million copies worldwide. Yet success did not freeze the material into a fixed form. Knopfler continued reshaping the songs on stage. He stretched pieces like Speedway at Nazareth into long, slow-burning live performances, sometimes pushing past 7 minutes, transforming tightly written studio narratives into expansive climaxes during tours in 2001 and 2002. Then came a moment that could have ended everything. In March 2003, Knopfler crashed his motorbike on Grosvenor Road in Belgravia, London. He broke his collarbone, his shoulder blade, and 7 ribs. Planned tours were cancelled for roughly 7 months. He was forced to step away from the guitar and commit to physiotherapy. It was a hard stop, the kind that makes you look at your hands and wonder whether the thing you built your entire life around can disappear in a single morning. Even after that scare, he did not return to the old, louder life. In February 2004, he traveled to Shangri-La Studios in Malibu to record an understated album titled Shangri-La. The studio itself carried deep history, tied to artists like the band, Bob Dylan, and Neil Young. The album ran just under an hour and was released later that year. One of its most memorable tracks, Boom, Like That, was inspired by Ray Kroc's autobiography. After more than 25 years in music and a near-fatal accident, Knopfler was still choosing to build singles from obscure business history rather than safe romantic themes. It said everything about the artist he became when no one was demanding spectacle. That same pattern echoed through his personal life. Major shifts handled quietly, without drama. In March 1972, while studying English at the University of Leeds, he married his school-age girlfriend, Kathy White. At the time, he was working as a journalist and playing local pubs for modest fees. Graduation in 1973 and a move to London introduced distance into the relationship. Friends later recall that the marriage ended sometime between 1973 and the mid-1970s. No scandal, no public fallout, just 2 people drifting apart as one of them gambled everything on an uncertain dream. The emotional residue of that period surfaced in early Dire Straits songs filled with loneliness, bedsits, and solitary walks through city streets. In November 1983, just weeks after Dire Straits completed the exhausting Love Over Gold touring cycle and edged closer to the pressure that would lead to Brothers in Arms, Mark married Lourdes Salomon, a London-based music executive. At the height of global fame in March 1987, they welcomed twin sons, Benji and Joseph, while the band was still riding a tour that had begun in 1985. Success paid for comfort, but it also kept them away for months at a time. By 1992 to 1993, as Dire Straits wound down and Mark turned toward film work and quieter projects, the marriage ended in divorce after roughly a decade. The separation pushed him even further toward a low-profile life. On February 14, 1997, at the age of 47, he married British actress and writer Kitty Aldridge in Barbados. Their first daughter, Isabella, was born in 1998. Their second, Katia Ruby Rose, arrived on November 25, 2003, just months after the motorcycle crash. The life they built together was deliberate rather than glamorous. A quiet home in Chelsea instead of a rock star compound. Kitty stepped away from acting and focused on writing novels. Mark built British Grove Studios in West London, choosing a routine where he could walk to work instead of disappearing on year-long tours. That marriage has now lasted more than 2 decades, aligning perfectly with his transformation from stadium frontman into a craftsman focused on tone, storytelling, and family stability. And even when the world tried to pull Dire Straits back into the spotlight, he kept stepping aside. In December 2017, Dire Straits were announced as inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for the class of 2018. By then, the band had sold more than 100 million albums worldwide. The induction ceremony took place on April 14, 2018, in Cleveland. On paper, it looked like the perfect moment for a grand reunion, the kind fans had waited decades to see. It wasn't meant to be. Mark Knopfler did not attend. There was no presenter, no formal introduction, and no performance, making it the first time in Rock and Roll Hall of Fame history that an act took the stage without being introduced or playing a single note. Only John Illsley, Alan Clark, and Guy Fletcher stepped forward to accept the honor. Illsley later explained it simply. Mark had no desire to reunite, and without him, there was no Dire Straits to perform. That was the end of it. The silence itself became part of the story. In the years that followed, Knopfler continued exactly as he always had, through quiet work, deliberate decisions, and achievements measured without the weight of stadium expectations. In April 2024, at the age of 74, he released his 10th solo studio album, One Deep River, recorded at British Grove Studios in London. The standard edition featured 12 tracks and arrived on April 11, 2024. Its songs drew from memories of the River Tyne, returning once again to place, time, and reflection rather than spectacle. That same year, he auctioned more than 120 guitars and amplifiers at Christie's, raising approximately $8.84 million. At least a quarter of the proceeds were directed to charitable causes, including the British Red Cross, Tusk, Brave Hearts of the Northeast, and Teenage Cancer Trust. There was no reunion announcement, no stadium tour on the horizon, just controlled, intentional work, and numbers that mattered for reasons far removed from applause. In the end, that choice says more than any encore ever could.